You know, I eat oysters, so you could say, what type of idiot would eat an oyster? Well, I do.
I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to be judgmental.
Welcome to the latest vlog that we have in our series on food safety for Highfield. And I'm joined today by Richard Sprenger. Richard, today we're going to talk about dangerous foods. Is there such a thing as dangerous foods, or is it dangerous practices? What's your view?
Hi, Sterling. Yes, I'm convinced, certainly, I believe there are foods which I described as dangerous. Maybe people can come up with different definitions. Maybe you've got some of your own, but I certainly believe there are foods which are dangerous. And those foods, to me, if you like, would be the foods that we advise vulnerable people not to eat. That would be one possible definition that we could use. Dangerous foods are those foods that food businesses don't really have control over. They have to rely on the supplier. And if the supplier lets them down, then there could be a food poisoning outbreak. And arguably, if the business has tried to do everything possible to select a reputable supplier, and that supplier lets them down, it's the food business that's going to carry the can.
So Richard, what about, can you name some dangerous foods then? So using that description, practically everything we eat is dangerous, and maybe that is the case if it's not handled properly, prepared properly. But can you give me some examples of food that you think might have a higher risk behind them?
Yeah, I can, and certainly, Sterling, I'd be looking at ready-to-eat foods that don't have a kill step would be a very broad definition, and then I'll start specific, but that's what I'd be looking at. If there's no kill step, because a caterer in particular, or a manufacturer, if there's a kill step there, that manufacturer is in control of the safety of that product. Yeah. So let's take it, generally speaking, you're going to be talking about ready-to-eat foods which are raw. That's one of them. Let's say maybe top of the list that causes quite a lot of food poisoning outbreaks, much more so than the number of times a week that we all eat this food, would be oysters. Oysters, to me, go on everybody's list as a dangerous food because if they're raw.
So Richard, I'm a great lover of oysters, and I eat a lot.
Yeah.
I know the fact that you can have Vibrio, parahemolyticus and the norovirus and things like that, but I still choose to eat oysters that don't have a kill step in them, but have been cleaned. But I don't like cooking oysters, for instance. I like them raw. So what would be your comment on that then? Is that a dangerous practice I'm indulged in?
Yes, but it's all relative. It doesn't mean to say that every time you eat a raw oyster, obviously, you're going to get food poisoning. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's just that, shall we say, eating a raw oyster has a much higher risk of getting food poisoning than lots of other foods that we eat. When you look at the statistics and you ask somebody, how many times this month have you eaten raw oysters? You say you like raw oysters. How often do you eat them?
At least once a week in the season. I am a great consumer of oysters. I just adore them.
Right, once a week. Most people that would eat them would only eat them when they go out to a restaurant. They might go out to a restaurant once a month, once every 2 months, once every 3 months. But if you then say to somebody, how often have you eaten, say, chicken, something like that, they'd probably say, oh, I've had it twice this week, or how often have you had other, cooked fish and so on. So you get other foods that are eaten a lot more frequently that cause less outbreaks. And that's one of the ways that you're looking at dangerous food.
But see, to me, I wouldn't characterize chicken as a dangerous food. What I'd say there are dangerous practices. If people don't store them correctly, if you don't cook them thoroughly enough to remove all the pathogens, that will be in a natural product like chicken. So does that mean it's dangerous because the practices aren't being followed, rather than there's an inherent dangerous food, that the food is dangerous?
Yeah. That's how I would interpret it, that with something like chicken, the majority of us, there are 1 or 2 places in different parts of the world where people eat raw chicken. I've had raw chicken sushi, inverted commas. which is a very dangerous practice to me and very dangerous food. But normally, it's the practices in the catering business that would ensure that the chicken is made safe to eat. With the oyster, the caterer can't do anything to make that safe. He can't apply, or she can't apply, any practices. They're relying on the supplier. If that oyster comes from a polluted source, polluted with fecal material, which is what causes the problem in the first place, then the actions that they can take are not going to get rid of the problem. You can't do anything other than cook it. But as you said, you want it raw. So if you want it raw, then you say, well, are you saying that people shouldn't eat oysters? I'm saying that vulnerable people shouldn't eat oysters. That's one thing. The other thing I'd say is carry out your own risk-benefit analysis. If you really, really love oysters and you're a fit, healthy young man, right, then if you want to eat oysters, go and eat oysters. The risks are very small, but the risks are just greater than other food. Personally, I don't like the taste of raw oysters, so my risk-benefit analysis is keep away from oysters. Now, if it was chocolate, that would be something different. If it was chocolate, I couldn't stop eating chocolate if it was the most dangerous food in the world. That's the problem.
Just to pick up on a point you mentioned there, you used the word vulnerability. I think that's really important when you're doing risk assessments, isn't it? Because,
yep,
you know, the authorities will say, look, if you're in this particular vulnerable group, maybe you're very old, you have a suppressed immune system, maybe you're pregnant, that vulnerable group of people, you might advise to say, when you're doing your risk assessment, it wouldn't be wise to eat, I don't know, a soft cheese or something like that.
yep.
There are certain foods that vulnerable people avoid, and then you've got food hypersensitivity, which I suppose then when you're looking at dangerous foods, you and I might, you know, sit here and have a nice glass of milk together, and it's healthy, it's nutritious, it's delicious. But then if you happen to be a vulnerable person with hypersensitivity to milk, I mean, it is the biggest allergen there is, certainly in the UK, and we've seen in this country, it kills people. So you could say, is milk a dangerous food because some people are allergic to it?
Yeah. If we start introducing allergens, have their own inverted commas dangerous foods, and I think you have to look at that entirely separate. I would, from what I'm looking at, are foods that are microbiologically dangerous, and I agree that obviously allergens are very dangerous to a certain group of people, whereas food poisoning will affect all of us, certainly most of us, but some are more vulnerable, the ones you described, immunocompromised, the very elderly, the young, and so on. And you've mentioned another dangerous food, which is raw milk. Raw milk, if it's contaminated when it comes into the business, there's not much you can do if you're going to serve it raw. There's no kill step. If you're going to use that in producing cheese, again, the cheese becomes a dangerous food. And again, you do a risk-benefit analysis. Are you in a vulnerable group? Well, if you're in a vulnerable group, don't eat it. If you're not in a vulnerable group, do you really, really enjoy it? Is there no alternative? And if you really enjoy it, then people are going to eat it, and that's what we do.
So that poses another interesting question. Is food dangerous, or isn't it? Is it the processes and the people? Because it is a mixture that makes a food dangerous. I think milk's a good one because in the UK you can actually sell unpasteurized milk, and so, you know, the reason pasteurization is there to kill pathogens and to reduce brucellosis, which was a terrible disease in this country. So you can actually go and buy unpasteurized milk, raw milk, can't you? But people are making a decision there, but they have to make an informed choice, don't you think? So if you think raw milk, it's unpasteurized, oh, it must be natural, it must be better for me, and you don't know the potential risks. So is consumer choice an important part of that? The informed consumer choosing the risk of the food they're eating?
Yes, I think that is important, that people do need to be informed to make that selection.
Personally, I don't think there's such thing as a dangerous food. There's food, and then there's it's fit for human consumption generally amongst the wide population, but it is, as you say, it's the source of the food, it's the way it's been prepared, it's the steps you can take to make that food safe is important, and the choices the consumers make, both, you know, when they're buying their food in their shopping trolleys, or they're cooking at home. Let me put one last one for you then. Fugu fish from Japan. I'm off to Tokyo in a couple of months, and fugu fish is very popular. I'm a great believer in eating fish, and you can get fugu fish poisoning, can't you? Is it the gonads of the fish have a toxin in there that can kill you? I mean, it's not like one of those things that you need a lot of things to kill you. It can be a small dose. So what do you think about something like fugu fish? Should it be on sale in the UK? If you brought it over to the UK, would you say, no, you can't sell it, it's too dangerous? Or
I'd certainly, I mean, as you said, the other common name for it is the puffer fish. Same thing. A delicacy in certain restaurants in Japan. And one thing I think that is really poetic about it, that my understanding, when a chef trains to prepare it, because you've got to prepare it, if you don't cut the poisonous bits out, you're going to end up, there's a high chance of you ending up dead. And as I understand, in the training of the chefs who are preparing the puffer fish, etc., they have to prepare it and eat it themselves before they qualify. So,
but you could argue there isn't that the chefs by law have to have a license, I believe, in Japan. So it's not like any chef can pick it up and say, I'm going to do fugu fish today. It's a very strictly controlled process. But it does make you wonder when you say dangerous food. Well, you know, if the chef makes a mistake, you will die. I mean, it's not one of those things that you've got a 1 in 1,000 chance of surviving. I mean, it's highly, highly toxic. So in your view, would you say that is a dangerous food and shouldn't be sold, or that's a dangerous food, it has to be treated properly and people should be aware of the risk?
I'm saying the latter. I'm not saying that dangerous food shouldn't be sold necessarily. I'm saying that there are foods that carry a much greater risk of food poisoning because of their inherent dangerous properties. There are another group of food, as you've said, that if they're not prepared, and this applies to all high-risk food, that if you don't prepare it correctly and safely with regard to cross-contamination and multiplication in particular and survival, if you don't control the hazards, then all food's going to be dangerous. I'm looking at those foods that a caterer normally is not able to treat the food in such a way as to make it any safer. Another one would be bean sprouts, raw bean sprouts. I mean, raw bean sprouts to me are something that they don't really taste of anything. I'm not sure what the benefits of raw bean sprouts are, but basically the food poisoning organism gets inside the actual bean sprout, if you like. So even if you could wash it in chlorinated water or in a disinfectant, it still wouldn't render it safe. There's nothing you can do other than cook it. So if you actually are going to serve raw bean sprouts, there is an increased risk. And there's been lots. I mean, what you do, you study all the different food vehicles that cause food poisoning and look at those that occur more frequently. Another one would be pate, chicken liver pate would be another one. Probably because, to be fair, it's undercooked. Same as pink duck. That's something that personally I'd class as a dangerous food because, again, there's not the kill step there. I think that there's quite a few. Unpasteurized juices are another one, whether that be apple juice, orange juice, if they're unpasteurized. Again, those are what I would class personally as dangerous foods.
I disagree with you on juices because unpasteurized juices are available. There's ultra heat treatment. I think surely something like lactobacillus, I think it is, the spoilage organism will kick in before a pathogen will. I mean, because sometimes foods spoil, don't they? And they tell you off. It's like milk almost, isn't it, as well? You know, and chicken, you can smell sometimes the fact that something's gone off before you start having to worry about anything else. Well, I think that's a really interesting conversation, Richard, about are there dangerous foods, and then what are the potentially dangerous foods? And what I'm hearing from you is that if there is a step that you can make this food safe, then it's only dangerous if people don't follow the correct steps. Right? That's a great thought to end on, Richard. So thank you very much.
Before you go, Sterling, we haven't covered your favourite topic.
Oh, what's that?
Eggs.
Eggs,
We haven't discussed whether eggs are a dangerous food or whether egg products are a dangerous food.
Well, we have done a webinar on that, but to me, eggs are potentially dangerous. As we know globally about the number of cases, we've seen a case in Poland and cases in other countries around the world. But you know, I'm a great advocate of the British Lion Mark, because those eggs have gone through a certain process to make sure they're safe, to give assurance, and the Food Standards Agency have turned around and said it's okay for vulnerable groups to eat runny eggs like we both do, as long as they've gone through that process. If you step out that process and you say, I'm going to have a farm gate egg, or I'm going to have a duck, or I'm going to have an egg that might have been imported and not covered by these controls, then I think, like you said, then you enter into you're taking an extra risk. And certainly if I was in a restaurant, I'd be making sure I use British Lion eggs, as do most British retailers, to be honest with you.
And that's good advice, Sterling, and certainly I'd agree with you. My own view on eggs was that even at the height of the outbreaks that we were suffering in the UK, personally, I thought the chance of getting food poisoning from an egg was very small indeed. However, when you look back and look at all the egg products without a kill step, the food vehicle was generally not eggs per se. If you ate a fried egg that wasn't fried long enough, or an egg that was still runny, the chances of getting food poisoning were very small, even at the height of the problem. What was causing all the problem was things like mayonnaise, which had been temperature abused, or mousse that had been temperature abused. They were the main problems. I also remember that one of our control measures, this was always stick in my memory, one of our control measures is when we had flocks of hens that were laying eggs, a few of which, a very small number, were contaminated. We went round and slaughtered all the hens, so that we decimated.
Things have moved on now, because all the hens and the breeding flocks have all been vaccinated against Salmonella, Erythritis, and Typherium as well. So it's the vaccination program that has taken Salmonella out of the British Lion eggs. But as we've seen in Spain recently, there's been a massive outbreak of Salmonella, because the traditional way of cooking one of their foods is to put runny eggs in there, and they're not covered by a scheme, and so therefore you can you know, it's a very famous restaurant, a very respectable restaurant, poisoned quite a lot of its clientele just because of the fact that they didn't have that kill step. It was very runny, and they didn't have the important thing, which is an egg assurance scheme, a safety scheme to back them up.
Exactly. You're spot on. And incidentally, we talk about well-known and famous restaurants causing outbreaks, and they're certainly not immune from outbreaks. And there's been several, and especially with oysters, going back to oysters, there's been some very well-known restaurants with causing food poisoning outbreaks through oysters and norovirus, which shows that even though you may be one of the most experienced and best chefs in the world, very difficult to deal with oysters and dangerous foods if your supplier isn't of the highest standard.
Well, that's a good thought to end our conversation on. Thank you, Richard. It's great speaking to an egg expert on the excellent you had. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thanks, Sterling.